the lost kingdom that Europe stole and then pretended never exist. There was once a kingdom so rich its rulers gave away gold like it was water, a place where libraries towered higher than church steeples, where traders crossed oceans, and where the streets glittered not with myth, but with actual treasure. A kingdom so powerful that when its name was spoken, it echoed through deserts, markets, and palaces across continents. But today, that name is barely a whisper, not because it never existed, but because someone made sure you'd never know it did. They erased it from the maps, buried it under stories of European glory, rewrote its legacy to make space for their own. Because this kingdom didn't collapse from war or famine or failure. It was stolen, and then it was forgotten. This is the story of Mali, not the country you see on the map today, but the golden empire that once ruled West Africa and held the kind of power Europe could only dream of. And the man at the center of it all? Mansa Musa. You've probably heard that name, maybe in a meme or a trivia question about the richest person in history. But what they don't tell you is how Europe responded to his rise. What they don't teach you is that this kingdom became so threatening to the global balance of power that its very existence had to be rewritten. Let's go back. It's the early 1300s. Europe is still clawing its way out of the Dark Ages. Famine, plague, religious wars. It's a continent of chaos. Meanwhile, across the Sahara, Mali is thriving. Stretching across modern-day Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Guinea, and Niger, this kingdom has trade routes, universities, and urban centers with populations that rival Europe's capitals. And at the heart of this golden empire, Timbuktu. Yeah, Timbuktu. That name you've heard tossed around like a joke or a metaphor for the middle of nowhere? It was once the beating heart of African knowledge, culture, and wealth. At its height, Timbuktu had over 180 schools and universities. Some of its libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts, works on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and law. Not African folklore, but advanced global knowledge. In fact, some historians now believe Timbuktu had more written records during the 14th century than most of Europe. But you didn't learn that in school, did you? Because you were never supposed to. And Mansa Musa? He wasn't just a king, he was a force of history. In 1324, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca. It was supposed to be a religious journey, but it became something else entirely. Along the way, he traveled with an entourage of over 60,000 people, servants, soldiers, scholars, camels carrying hundreds of pounds of gold. He gave it away freely, to the poor, to cities, to anyone in need. So much, in fact, that when he passed through Cairo, he crashed the local economy. Gold became so devalued from his generosity that Egypt didn't recover for 12 years. The world noticed. But not in admiration, in fear. Because up until that moment, the global balance of power, at least in Europe's eyes, was supposed to look a certain way, Europe on top, the Islamic world as rivals, Africa as a mysterious, uncivilized mass. But here was Mansa Musa, casually giving away gold like it was copper, representing a kingdom richer and more educated than any of them had imagined. The shock rippled across every major power center. Cartographers in Europe rushed to include him in their maps, but not as a real ruler, as a symbol, a curiosity, something exotic, not equal. There's a famous Catalan atlas drawn in 1375. It shows a man, dark-skinned, crowned, sitting on a golden throne, holding a scepter and a nugget of gold in one hand. It's Mansa Musa. But the way he's drawn? It's not as a sovereign, it's as an object, a keeper of wealth for European dreams to steal. Because that's exactly what came next. Europeans didn't just want to admire Mali's riches, they wanted them. By the 15th century, as Portugal began sailing down the West African coast, the game changed. European powers weren't interested in scholarly exchange or mutual trade. They came for gold, slaves, and land. And Mali? It was already beginning to crack. Mansa Musa had died. His successors were less powerful, less stable. Internal divisions weakened the empire, and that's when Europe made its move. They didn't invade overnight. They rewrote the narrative first. They began describing West Africa as primitive, dangerous, uncivilized. Despite Mali's libraries, despite Timbuktu's architecture, despite generations of learning, the story was changed, and that lie made conquest easier. By the 1500s, the transatlantic slave trade began, and Mali, once the most powerful kingdom in Africa, became a target. Its knowledge, looted, its gold, taken, its history, covered up. Europe didn't just erase Mali's borders, they erased Mali's memory. And the textbooks that followed, the school maps, the history curriculum, all of it told you a different story. One where Africa needed Europe, one where civilization flowed in one direction, one where Mansa Musa became a cartoon, not a king. Ask yourself this. Why were you taught about the Medici family's wealth, but not the empire that once crashed gold markets? Why is Timbuktu a joke, and not honored like Athens or Rome? Why do we celebrate explorers who stole from this kingdom, but not the scholars who once filled its libraries? Because the lie was easier. Because history is written by the thieves, not the stolen. But the ruins still whisper. The manuscripts, hidden for centuries in private homes, are still being uncovered. Thousands of them, detailing science, medicine, astronomy, and law, all predating the so-called European Renaissance. The story of Mali wasn't lost. It was buried, on purpose. And now, we're digging it back up. They told you Europe discovered the world. They said Columbus found new continents. They crowned da Gama, Magellan, and Diaz as navigators who opened the seas. But what they didn't tell you is where those men got their maps, or whose knowledge guided their sails across oceans they claimed had never been crossed before. Because before Europe even dared to look west or south or beyond their known horizon, Mali already had the roots. They just didn't leave them in the hands of men who would write them into books. You see, when Mansa Musa ruled, he wasn't just sending gold across kingdoms. He was sending ideas. Mali's scholars were in contact with centers of learning from Morocco to Cairo to the Middle East. Books from Persia, maps from Andalusia, and manuscripts from ancient Egypt passed through Timbuktu's libraries and were copied, translated, and preserved by scribes who understood the power of knowledge. One of the most famous of these centers was the Sankore University of Timbuktu, a vast complex where students studied astronomy, botany, engineering, medicine, and theology, centuries before European universities even knew these disciplines existed. But these weren't just books of philosophy, these were manuals, technical documents, navigation records, charts of the stars, seasonal winds, trade routes along the West African coast, across the Sahara, and into the Atlantic Ocean. Let that sink in. When Portuguese explorers began hugging the African coast in the 15th century, what they found wasn't virgin land. They found ports. They found traders who already had international connections. They found cities that had been functioning as hubs of commerce and education for generations. And most dangerously, they found maps. There are scattered accounts in Portuguese records, usually buried deep in footnotes, that mention local navigators, interpreters, or guides who assisted European ships along the West African coast. But what those records never admit is that many of those guides were carrying knowledge that predated the European vessels themselves. So what did Europe do? They didn't celebrate the source. They confiscated it. They took the maps, changed the names, burned the originals, and redrew the world with themselves at the center. Take this example. The Piri Reis map, a famous Ottoman map from 1513 that shows coastlines of South America and Africa with stunning accuracy. Far more advanced than any European map of the time. Scholars have long wondered how this map was so precise when much of the New World hadn't even been charted yet. But what they overlook is that the map was based on earlier sources. Sources that Piri Reis himself said came from older foreign documents, including some that may have originated from African or Islamic sources no longer in circulation. And how many of those sources had passed through Mali? Through Timbuktu? We don't know, because most of those records were either destroyed, stolen, or lost during the colonial campaigns that followed. But what we do know is this: Europe's golden age didn't begin in isolation. It began by plundering a kingdom that had already mastered what they were just beginning to imagine. Let's go deeper. In 1411, just over a decade before Portugal's major maritime campaigns began, a Malian ruler named Abu Bakr II reportedly launched a massive fleet west across the Atlantic. According to both Arab chroniclers and West African oral tradition, he abdicated the throne to explore what lay beyond the ocean. Some sources claim he never returned. Others say his fleet made landfall in South America or the Caribbean. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a state-sponsored expedition, a royal-funded journey with sailors, scientists, and ships. And even if you dismiss the story as myth, ask yourself, why would a kingdom send ships into the Atlantic if they didn't already know how to navigate it? Because Mali knew. They had knowledge of ocean currents, the same ones later used by European explorers. They understood how to read the stars, catch the wind, and build seaworthy vessels capable of long-distance travel. And what happened to that knowledge? It vanished. Not because it wasn't real, but because someone made sure it wouldn't survive. When colonial powers began expanding into Africa, they weren't just after land or slaves. They were after intellectual control. European agents raided libraries in Mali, burned records, and classified African written history as myth or folklore, even when they were looking straight at centuries-old documents written in Arabic and classical African script. Imagine discovering a house full of books and then burning it because the truth inside didn't fit your story. That's what happened in Mali. And Timbuktu? Once the pride of an empire, it was turned into a ruin, not just physically, but in the global imagination. The name itself became a punchline, a metaphor for somewhere far, empty, meaningless. How does the world go from calling a city the Pearl of Knowledge to calling it the Middle of Nowhere? Manipulation, deliberate erasure, strategic ignorance. And yet, pieces of the truth survived. In secret corners of Mali, families passed down ancient manuscripts, wrapped in cloth, hidden under floors, protected from war, colonizers, and time. Scholars in the 21st century are only now beginning to unearth these texts, tens of thousands of them. And what they reveal is shocking. Detailed scientific theories, diplomatic letters to foreign rulers, advanced math and physics equations, journals of trade across the Mediterranean and beyond. All from a kingdom we were taught never really mattered. But now you know better. Now you know why they hid it. Because if the world knew Africa once led the intellectual frontier, then the colonial narrative would fall apart. The idea of civilizing the continent would collapse. The myth of European superiority would crack wide open. So instead, they rewrote it. They took Mali's gold, then its books, then its name. But here's the thing about the truth. It survives, in stories, in ruins, in names whispered by old people who never let the flame die. And if you've made it this far into the story, you're keeping that flame alive. Silence can be louder than truth, more powerful than lies, more enduring than war. Because once you bury something deep enough, beneath enough textbooks, under enough rewritten stories, behind enough museum glass, it starts to disappear, not just from the record, but from the imagination. That's what happened to Mali. That's what happened to Mansa Musa. That's what happened to Timbuktu. Not because their stories weren't incredible, but because they were too incredible, too disruptive, too undeniable, too dangerous to the world Europe was trying to build, one where they were always first, always greatest, always right. So instead of denying the truth outright, they did something smarter. They stopped talking about it. No statues to Mansa Musa in Paris or London, despite the fact that his economic impact shook the known world. No required readings in European or American schools about the intellectual wealth of Timbuktu, despite the libraries that predated Oxford and Cambridge. No mention of Abu Bakr II in history classes, even though he attempted transatlantic travel a century before Columbus. They didn't have to lie, they just had to ignore. And over time, ignorance becomes normal. Entire generations grew up believing Africa was nothing more than a continent full of tribal societies, untouched by sophistication until Europeans arrived with ships and flags. And what was once the empire of gold and knowledge became a blank space. You want proof? Walk into almost any high school in the Western world and ask a student to name one African kingdom before colonization, one African scientist from the 14th century, one African city known for its libraries, not its poverty. Most won't have an answer, but they'll know who Columbus was. They'll know about the Age of Discovery. They might even know about European royals from the same period who never set foot outside their castles. That's not education. That's historical gatekeeping, and it didn't happen by accident. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when colonial powers redrew Africa's borders and seized control of its institutions, they didn't just plunder land and resources, they plundered truth. They commissioned textbooks that reinforced European dominance. They trained local teachers to repeat the same sanitized versions of history. They funded archaeological missions, and when those missions found ruins or scrolls that didn't fit the narrative, they were quietly dismissed or reclassified. Even now, many Western museums sit on hoards of African manuscripts that remain untranslated, unpublished, and hidden away. Not because they're worthless, but because they raise questions no one wants to answer. But here's the question. Why the silence? Why erase Mali? Because if the world truly understood what that empire represented, everything else would start to unravel. The idea that African societies needed European civilization, the belief that wealth and learning always flowed north to south, the myth that progress comes from conquest instead of community. Mali was proof of something that challenges the entire colonial script, that Africa didn't need to be saved, it needed to be remembered. And that's why silence became the most powerful weapon of all. But silence only works if it's unbroken. And you're here, listening, or watching, or reading, which means we're breaking it now. So if you've made it this far into the story, it's because you feel that silence cracking, and you know this is the kind of truth that doesn't belong in the shadows anymore. So, do me a favor. If you believe stories like this matter, the kind that school skipped on purpose, then hit the like button right now. And tell me in the comments, why do you think they never taught us this in school? And if you want more hidden history that changes how you see the world, go ahead and subscribe. Because this channel is where the forgotten gets remembered, one story at a time. Now back to Mali. Because what happened after the silence wasn't peace. It was replacement. New borders, new languages, new maps. Colonial rulers renamed cities, burned documents, and mocked the past as myth. They turned Mali into a footnote. Mansa Musa became a legend instead of a leader. Timbuktu was downgraded from center of learning to symbol of isolation. They didn't just steal history, they rebranded it. They made Mali's erasure feel natural, as if nothing important had ever happened there, as if Europe had been the beginning of time. And here's the twisted irony. The very systems that replaced Mali's legacy, the trade networks, the banking routes, the global resource pipelines, were built on the gold that was stolen from that kingdom. Gold that once funded libraries, gold that once bought manuscripts, gold that once fueled a vision of prosperity without conquest. Mali's wealth didn't disappear. It became foundation capital for the Renaissance, for colonial armies, for industrial economies that pretended to invent things they inherited from the people they conquered. So when we talk about Mali, we're not talking about ruins in the sand. We're talking about the ground floor of the modern world, paved over so neatly you almost didn't notice what was underneath. But now you do, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start questioning every line in every textbook, every explorer statue that doesn't mention the maps he used, every museum exhibit that says unknown origin. And you realize something else. Mali didn't fall, it was buried. And just like a buried city, it can rise again. Not as a kingdom, but as a truth. And in the end, truth is harder to silence than any empire. Some ghosts don't haunt with chains or whispers. They don't creak doors or flicker lights. Some ghosts haunt through influence, shaping the world from beneath the surface, rearranging power silently, invisibly, like roots under stone. Mali is that kind of ghost. They told you it disappeared, that it was swallowed by time, that it crumbled into dust and sand. But that's the lie, the comfortable story, the neat ending they gave you. Because the truth is, Mali didn't die. It went underground. And it's still there, in the foundations of everything they told you started in Europe. You just have to know where to look. Let's start with the obvious. The gold. Gold from Mali didn't just dazzle travelers in the 14th century. It made its way into European economies and royal treasuries. It funded banks, palaces, and expeditions. The wealth that poured out of Mali helped stabilize currency systems in places like Venice, Florence, and Lisbon. Coins minted in Europe bore weight measurements that matched West African standards, because Mali set the gold standard long before the West did. The European hunger for that gold drove the early expeditions down Africa's west coast, not to explore, but to extract. Traders didn't arrive with dreams of mutual exchange. They came with cargo holds, with chains, with blueprints for domination, and behind those blueprints, the memory of a place that once commanded trade routes, not just participated in them. Now let's talk about the manuscripts. Thousands of texts, many still hidden in private collections across West Africa, are being digitized today. They cover everything from advanced algebra to surgery, ethics to astronomy. And when historians examine them closely, they find phrases, diagrams, even entire pages that match or predate discoveries later credited to Europe. These aren't scraps, they're proof. Proof that Mali was part of a global knowledge network, that its thinkers weren't isolated. They were contributors, partners in an intellectual conversation that stretched from Baghdad to Grenada to Mali to Timbuktu. But those manuscripts were locked away, not just by time, but by policy. Colonial agents declared them primitive, unworthy of scholarly focus. Some were confiscated, others were destroyed. Yet they survived, in basements, in trunks, in the hands of families who knew they were holding on to truths worth dying for. And now, those truths are being translated, published, studied, quietly rewriting the history of science and philosophy, one forgotten manuscript at a time. But Mali's ghost doesn't stop at economics or education. It's in architecture. You've seen it without even knowing it. The grand mud brick mosques of Djenné, with their soaring towers and intricate wooden beams, inspired sustainable design techniques that architects in the modern world now study and imitate. Their heat control, natural insulation, and environmental harmony are centuries ahead of what Western cities are only beginning to prioritize. It's in language and trade systems. West African trade languages, developed under Mali's control, laid the foundation for multilingual markets. Systems of weights and measurements were so advanced they became templates for later colonial systems. Even some modern African currencies today trace their roots back to Malian monetary philosophy. trade backed not just by wealth but by trust and shared knowledge. And yes, Mali's ghost lives in the diaspora too. During the centuries of transatlantic slave trading, many of those taken from West Africa were the descendants of Mali's scholars, merchants, soldiers, and artists. These weren't nameless captives. They were heirs of a kingdom, stolen from their lineage, stripped of their history, and thrown into a world that told them they came from nothing. But you can't kill memory that easily. That memory came across the ocean in songs, in prayers, in rhythms. It showed up in architecture in the Americas, in rice cultivation techniques in the South, in resistance strategies during slave revolts. The ghost of Mali breathed through survival and left fingerprints on every culture it touched. Even now, in digital databases, scholars are finding linguistic matches between phrases in Gula Geechee, Jamaican patois, and Haitian Creole with words from ancient Mande dialects, the language spoken by the people of Mali. You can silence the story. You can burn the books. But when an empire builds its identity in the minds of its people, it never truly leaves. So when we talk about Mali today, we're not talking about nostalgia. We're not talking about ruins. We're talking about unfinished business. Because the world still lives in the shadow of a lie, the lie that all greatness flowed from the north. But every blueprint they claimed as their own, Mali had already drawn it, in gold, in ink, in legacy. And that legacy is waking up again. Young historians across Africa are rebuilding Mali's memory. Artists are reimagining Mansa Musa not as a trivia answer, but as a global icon. Economists are reevaluating West African trade structures for 21st century relevance. Cultural groups are preserving Mande traditions with new pride, with new fire. And the world, it's finally starting to listen. Not because Mali begged for recognition, but because you can't hide the sun forever. Eventually, even the deepest ghost walks into the light. So the next time you see a textbook that skips from ancient Egypt straight to European exploration, ask what's missing. The next time a museum labels a golden artifact unknown African origin, ask what it's hiding. And the next time someone tells you Africa didn't build anything lasting, tell them the ghost of Mali is still here. It's in the money. It's in the maps. It's in the music. It's in the manuscript they haven't translated yet. It's in the mind of the next kid who refuses to believe their history started with slavery. And it's in you. Because if you made it this far, you're not just hearing the story. You're carrying it. Some stories come back louder the longer you try to silence them. They crawl under doors, whisper through generations, cling to names, songs, dust, and bone. And by the time they rise, by the time they are finally heard, they don't ask for space. They take it back. That's what's happening now with Mali. The empire that was erased, buried, renamed, repackaged, and turned into a footnote is stepping back into the center of the page. Not because anyone invited it, but because history doesn't belong to the loudest. It belongs to the truth. And the truth is this: Mali never left. It lived in the manuscripts scholars once feared to translate. It lived in the architecture modern designers are now praising for its genius. It lived in the rhythms carried across oceans by enslaved people who remembered the sound of home even after the names were beaten out of them. Now it lives in the questions that won't go away. Why weren't we taught this? Why was Mali reduced to folklore while Europe's stolen wealth was called achievement? Why is Mansa Musa remembered as a meme, but not as a ruler whose economic decisions reshaped the currency of continents? Because the moment people begin to remember, really remember, the story changes. It's no longer a tale of African need and European rescue. It's a tale of African sovereignty, brilliance, and betrayal. And that's a truth some systems were never designed to hold. But those systems are breaking now. Let's talk facts. In recent years, scholars across West Africa have launched massive efforts to recover and digitize the surviving Timbuktu manuscripts. With global support and local leadership, they're scanning, transcribing, and translating thousands of texts that sat hidden in family homes for centuries. We're not talking about folklore. We're talking about astronomical charts that match contemporary knowledge, medical treatises on surgery, hygiene, and herbal treatment, economic models that mapped out trade taxes and international exchange long before the West formalized those ideas, political philosophies that proposed checks on rulers and protections for citizens, ideas that sound suspiciously like modern democracy. These weren't one-off documents. They were part of an intellectual infrastructure, a civilization-wide belief that knowledge was currency and education was a civic duty. And now that those manuscripts are coming back into the light, so is the weight of their erasure. Because these revelations don't just rewrite African history, they reposition Africa in global history. And once Mali is placed where it belongs, at the center, not the margin, the entire story of the world shifts. The age of exploration? Not the start of connection, but the interruption of a global network that already existed. The Enlightenment? Not the birth of reason, but a selective remembering of what other civilizations had long practiced. The Industrial Revolution? Not pure invention, but innovation layered over centuries of stolen labor and extracted wealth, including Mali's. This isn't about guilt. It's about clarity. It's about honoring the empires, minds, and memories that were never supposed to survive, but did. And what's coming next? Reclamation. Artists are already painting Mansa Musa not as a distant relic, but as a living icon, surrounded by gold, yes, but also by books, students, and stars. In Senegal, Mali, and Ghana, musicians are weaving his legacy into verses. Fashion designers are drawing from Mande tradition. Writers are resurrecting the names of queens, generals, and scholars who once walked the corridors of Timbuktu. This is cultural memory rising like water. And it's not just happening in Africa. Diaspora communities, from New York to London to Bahia, are digging up their roots, retracing the lines that were snapped by the slave trade, finding echoes of Mali in family stories, in rhythms, in resilience. Because the empire wasn't just geographic, it was spiritual, intellectual, human. And it's returning in the hearts of people who refuse to believe that their greatness began with oppression. You included. If you've made it to this point, if you've sat through this story, followed every stolen coin, every burned manuscript, every silenced name, then you're part of that return. You're not just learning history, you're resurrecting it. And that changes things. It changes how we understand power, as not something to be seized, but remembered. It changes how we understand wealth, not as a pile of stolen gold, but as a system of shared knowledge. It changes how we define civilization, not by who shouted the loudest, but by who built something that lasted. Mali built something that lasted, despite war, despite colonizers, despite generations of erasure. Because when your foundation is built on wisdom, not just walls, you don't fall. You wait. And now, the wait is over. So what do we do with this story? We carry it. We share it. We demand its place next to the pyramids and cathedrals and castles that dominate the world's imagination. We remind the world that Africa didn't need to be discovered. It needed to be acknowledged. And we remind ourselves that forgetting is a choice. So is remembering. Mansa Musa's empire may never rise again in gold, but it's rising in truth. And truth, that's more valuable than anything buried under sand.